Tonight we slip quietly into a world where whistling while you work could literally get you arrested. You're barefoot, wrapped in itchy wool, and trudging through the damp streets of a medieval town before the sun has fully shown its face. The fog hugs the uneven cobblestones like it's clinging on for dear life, and your breath puffs in little clouds, the only visible sign of warmth in a place that forgot what central heating even is. You think you're alone, so you hum. Just a little tune. Maybe it's something familiar, like a lullaby your mother used to sing or whatever medieval earworm has been stuck in your head for the past fortnight. But before you can get to the second verse, bam, a gloved hand clamps your shoulder. It's not a ghost, it's worse, the local night watch. And he is not thrilled with your early morning performance. Apparently, there's a law here, no singing before sunrise. You laugh nervously, thinking he must be joking. He isn't. You probably won't survive this. I mean, you will, because this is bedtime history and not actual medieval Europe, but if you had to live here, your taste for music might land you in the stocks. Or worse, be labeled a drunkard, a troublemaker, or even a heretic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there awkwardly as the guard scolds you, but instead of being hauled off, he shoves a finger in your face and tells you to keep your voice down. People are sleeping, God is listening, and you, apparently, have no respect. He leaves you with a final warning and vanishes back into the mist like a moralizing bat. You don't know it yet, but you've just stumbled into one of the stranger, quieter corners of medieval law, the kind that governs noise, and more specifically, music. It's not just singing that's frowned upon. In some towns, even playing a lute or whistling could get you into trouble if you did it too early. And no, it wasn't just about grumpy neighbors. There were deeper layers to this whole thing. Social order, religious devotion, city planning, class resentment, all woven together with the silken thread of silence. What you've encountered is something surprisingly common across several parts of medieval Europe, ordinances that literally banned early noise, with special attention to song. Imagine you're in 14th century Nuremberg. The city ordinances there, yes, they had those specifically mentioned penalties for street music after curfew or before morning bells. And they weren't the only ones. In parts of France, Italy, and England, singing before dawn could be considered anything from disruptive to downright dangerous. Why? Because early singing messed with the schedule. Not just the daily rhythm of the town, but the divine one. Remember, this was a time when hours weren't measured by the minute hand on a smartwatch, but by prayer, by bell, by the sun inching its sleepy way up the sky. Singing before sunrise was jumping the line, like someone yelling happy birthday an hour early and throwing off the entire vibe of the party. Historians still argue whether these singing laws were strictly enforced or more like social suggestions backed with the occasional fine and a lot of side eye. But there's solid evidence of towns taking this kind of thing very seriously. In fact, some city statutes were written with almost poetic precision about when a town's soundscape should begin. Not a moment before. And here's the kicker, it wasn't always about volume. You could bang on a pot at the right time and be fine. But hum a tune before curfew lifted, and suddenly you're persona non grata. Because singing was symbolic. It wasn't just noise. It was expressive, emotional, spontaneous. All the things that threatened strict medieval order. Let's not forget, too, that medieval towns were dense. Close quarters, wooden walls, echoing alleys. Sound traveled fast and far. If one person started singing, others might join in. And suddenly, instead of peaceful pre-dawn silence, you had what authorities might call incipient chaos. The Middle Ages didn't exactly have a high tolerance for chaos. Especially before breakfast. And so, as you creep through this town, still rubbing sleep out of your eyes, you start to notice something. The silence isn't just absence. It's maintained. Enforced. There's a rhythm here. A discipline. A few birds chirp high above, sure. A rooster tries his luck and isn't immediately silenced. He has rooster immunity. But the people, oh, they're quiet. Doors don't creak open yet. No carts rattle. Even the dogs seem to have internalized the curfew. It's like the whole place is holding its breath. You pass a small wooden sign nailed to a post. The lettering's weathered, but you can still make it out. No singing or musical noise before the third bell. Beneath it, scratched in a lighter hand, unless you're the mayor's son. Ah, class privilege. Timeless. Still, it makes you wonder, how did it come to this? Why was music, something we now associate with joy, beauty, even healing, once seen as a threat if it came too early? Well, that's the journey we're on tonight. And trust me, it only gets weirder from here. But for now, you pull your cloak tighter, silence your humming, and blend back into the quiet fog as the town prepares to wake on its schedule, not yours. You tiptoe past shuttered homes, each with its own leaning frame and time-stained thatch. Chimneys sleep for now, and not a soul stirs behind the cracked glass and cloth-draped windows. The town feels paused. Not frozen, but waiting like an orchestra of wooden carts, iron hinges, and market cries all on mute until some unseen conductor lifts his baton. It's eerie, but kind of beautiful too. You're not just avoiding noise now, you're studying it. Listening for it. Or rather, the lack of it. The longer you walk these silent lanes, the more you realize how deliberate the quiet is. It's not just courtesy. It's custom. Law. Almost ritual. In medieval towns, silence wasn't just golden, it was the framework on which everything else hung. Cities like Ghent, York, or Bologna had very specific codes about what kind of activity could happen at what hour. Most things were tied to the bells, those deep, clanging voices from churches or town halls that marked canonical hours, work shifts, even time to light or extinguish fires. You start to hear it in your head: prime, terce, sext, none, the whole liturgical playlist. And this isn't just for the monks. Townspeople, even layfolk, had their rhythms shaped by this divine schedule. Waking before the bells and doing something as expressive as singing, that could be seen as jumping the gun. Worse, it could be interpreted as an act of pride, like saying your own rhythm was more important than God's. Historians still argue whether ordinary townsfolk really obeyed these temporal restrictions or if it was more of a pious ideal than daily reality. You hear some scholar mutter in your brain. But laws existed. Ordinances were written. And if laws are inked, they were meant to be read or at least yelled at someone caught humming Greensleeves at 5 a.m. And look, we've all had that one neighbor who thinks 4:30 a.m. is a great time for interpretive yodeling or overly enthusiastic leaf blowing. Medieval towns? That was the norm they were trying to avoid. You sneak into the town square, where everything waits in hibernation. Market stalls covered in burlap. Wagons sleeping beneath drawn tarps. There's a man sitting slumped on a bench, cloaked and still. At first, you think he's dozing. But then he raises a finger to his lips. He's not asleep. He's just respecting the hush. A cat darts past. A chicken clucks from somewhere it shouldn't be. But the humans? Still ghosts. Why? Because the town isn't awake yet, and no one wants to be the one to stir it. You think of modern cities and how the hum of engines and neon buzz never really fades. But here, night is not the opposite of day. It's a character all its own. It has its own rules, moods, expectations. And early singing, it breaks the spell. There's a superstition at play too. In many places, night was the domain of spirits, of danger, of the unknown. The veil between worlds thinned with the dark, and quiet was a kind of protection. Start singing too early and you might invite something back, something that wasn't quite done roaming. You chuckle nervously and tug your cloak tighter. Just superstition, right? Still, it explains why some communities treated early singing with suspicion. Sure, some of it was about sleep, but a lot of it was about spiritual boundaries. You didn't burst into song in the hours when demons were said to whisper or witches were believed to fly. Just bad manners. Besides, there were rules. And not following them in a medieval town was a big deal. You couldn't just sing willy-nilly without being seen as, at best, a fool, and at worst, a threat. There's a record from 15th century Strasbourg where a man was reportedly fined for producing ungodly sound before the tolling of first bell. Was he drunk? Possibly. Was he singing something saucy? Probably. But the point wasn't the lyrics, it was the timing. And here's your quirky tidbit for the evening. In one Swiss village, singing too early wasn't just illegal, it was rumored to bring bad harvests. Yes, you could personally offend the barley gods by busting out a tune before sunrise. That's some serious auditory pressure. You settle near a fountain that's more moss than marble now, and wonder who even enforced these rules. Enter the watchman, or more dramatically, the sergeants of the peace. These weren't just sleepy rentier cops with jangly keys. They were serious business, especially in bigger towns. And part of their job, keep things quiet until the right time. Some even had curfew rounds where they'd knock on shutters and tell people to douse candles, go to bed, stop singing, and yes, keep it down. Like bedtime babysitters with batons. The same men you met earlier. They've been trained not just in spotting crime, but in hearing deviance. To them, a sudden song isn't entertainment. It's a signal something's wrong. A brawl, a break-in, a blasphemy. If you're up and singing before the bells, you're not just awake, you're suspicious. And that suspicion stretches into today. Ever notice how, even now, we frown on people being too happy too early in the morning? That person chirping in the office kitchen before coffee? Deeply suspect. Some things are just universal. As the light begins to bleed into the square, soft and gold and mist-filtered, you hear it. Not a song, but a bell. Low. Measured. Solid. The first of the day. And with it, life. Shutters open. Hooves clatter. A cough here, a yawn there. Someone mutters about needing bread. You even hear a child giggle. But no singing, yet. You're still holding your breath, waiting to see who will break the spell first. And then, from somewhere near the bakery, it starts a soft, low humming. Wordless. Gentle. But this time, perfectly timed. The tune floats gently above the rising sounds of the town. A woman kneading dough hums while dusting flour on her counter, her notes as warm and simple as the bread she's preparing. This time, no guard appears. No finger wagging. No threat of divine punishment. Because the bell has tolled. The town is officially awake, and with it, song is allowed. You can almost feel the invisible line that's just been crossed. What was once forbidden is now familiar. Welcome, even. And you start to realize this isn't just about song. It's about time, structure, and who gets to define when the world is allowed to begin. Back in your own world, you probably rely on your alarm clock or a phone screen to tell you it's morning. But here, you'd have the bells. Or, if you were poorer or lived further from the town center, maybe a rooster. Or the sun itself. But the bell held the most authority. In fact, some towns had layers of bells like a medieval snooze system. One to rouse the monks. One for market stall setup. One to mark the opening of the city gates. One to declare the official start of daytime. Each bell had a meaning, a purpose, a permission. And until that bell rang, certain things stayed forbidden, including singing. This wasn't just about noise pollution. It was about order. Medieval life didn't run on whimsy. It ran on predictable rhythms. Anything outside that rhythm was suspicious. Maybe even dangerous. Historians still argue whether these bell systems were originally religious in nature or evolved as a civil convenience. After all, not everyone in the town was part of the church, but everyone heard the bells. Still, it's clear they acted like medieval timekeepers long before personal clocks were a thing. A town without bells was like a town without bones, it couldn't hold its shape. And get this, in many towns, who got to ring the bells, and when, was hotly guarded territory. Church officials, town councils, and sometimes even noble families would fight, sometimes literally, over control of the bell tower. Because controlling time meant controlling people. Which brings us to an amusing little story from 13th century France. In a sleepy village just outside Paris, a new bell ringer took it upon himself to ring the morning bell 7 minutes early. Why? Because he wanted a head start at the bakery. He figured, why not wake everyone up and secure the first baguette? Well, the local priest nearly combusted. He declared the bell the voice of divine time and accused the bell ringer of disrupting the sacred rhythm. The baker, for his part, was flattered. You continue strolling as the streets slowly animate. Merchants lift their carts into place. Children dart around corners. Dogs bark, chickens flap. Someone is already selling eels, which, if you're curious, do not smell better in the morning. And still, no one's singing loudly. Humming, maybe. Quiet tunes under breath. But nothing that might seem too cheerful, too loud, too early. Because even though the bells have tolled, people remember the rules. You're allowed to sing now, sure, but there's a vibe to maintain. No madrigals at full volume before the bread's even cooled. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. And when people sang too early, it wasn't just annoying, it could mess with the daily operations of the town. Imagine a group of young apprentices, still half drunk from last night, stumbling home and loudly harmonizing just before sunrise. Not only would they disrupt the peace, but they might confuse others into thinking it was time to wake up and get moving. Bakers might start fires too soon. Merchants could miss their deliveries. Monks might rush their prayers. The whole system could unravel. You pass an old plaque on the wall of the Butcher's Guildhall. It's faded, but a few words catch your eye. Noise before bell is thievery of time. A poetic way of saying, don't mess with the morning. In Florence, there were actual reports of people being fined for singing in the streets before proper hour, often interpreted not just as bad manners but as public nuisance bordering on civic sabotage. Which brings us to another quirk of medieval city life, curfews and sunrise laws. Many cities had legally enforced start and stop times. Not just for shops and gates, but for sounds. You could be fined or even publicly shamed for making noise during unsanctioned hours. And while the curfew usually focused on evening quiet, morning noise was part of the same coin. The space between dark and day was liminal, delicate. The town's identity, its calm, its order, was at stake. Let's not forget, sound in a medieval town wasn't just background. It was intimate. These towns were close-packed. No insulation. No double-paned windows. Every whisper traveled. If you started singing a ballad about a forbidden love affair, 5 families would know about it before sunrise, and one of them would be your aunt. In some regions, early singing was even associated with bad omens. A traveler's diary from 1481 mentions an innkeeper in Cologne who would spit thrice and throw salt if someone sang before the bell. Superstition met statute. And here's your fringe tidbit for the day. In parts of rural Wales, there was a belief that singing before sunrise could awaken the famished dead spirits so hungry for life they'd cling to the voice that woke them. Which, if nothing else, is a pretty good excuse to just not sing before breakfast. Still, despite all these codes and customs, people found ways to stretch the rules. Humming inside your house? Probably fine. Singing quietly while tending livestock outside the town walls? Risky, but doable. Teaching your kids lullabies before sunrise, as long as it was indoors and no one tattled? That's just parenting. But in the main square, within earshot of the church and its bells? Better to wait. You glance up again as the sun finally clears the rooftops, dusting everything in that soft medieval gold light Instagram would kill for. A man with a lyre starts to play, slow and sweet. He's careful, respectful. The market is open. The rhythm has begun. The silence has passed. And just like that, the music returns to the town not as rebellion, but as ritual. You follow the lyre's melody through the winding lanes, weaving between carts of cabbage and wheels of uncomfortably pungent cheese. The song feels gentle, warm, unthreatening. No one glares. No guards raise their spears. It's officially safe to be tuneful. But you start to wonder, why was it ever dangerous in the first place? The answer lies in a peculiar medieval belief that noise could be sinful. Not noise like a sneeze or a dropped ladle, but expressive noise. Laughter too loud. Singing too early. Celebrating out of turn. In many communities, sound was seen not just as disruption, but as spiritual misalignment. You duck into the shadow of a narrow alley where laundry lines sway like surrender flags, and the sound changes again. Muffled now. Still warm, but more introspective. You pass a small wooden door that creaks open slightly, and inside, a monk sweeping a stone floor pauses. He nods at you but doesn't speak. And certainly doesn't sing. Because here, in sacred space, silence is not absence. It's presence. Of the divine. Of focus. Of discipline. You're not in the town square anymore. You've wandered into one of the oldest monasteries in the region. A place where noise isn't just discouraged, it's regulated, measured, sacred. And when you ask the monk why singing before sunrise might be frowned upon, he just gives you a slow, knowing smile and says, because the Lord is still listening. But the people aren't ready. That's your cue to shut up and listen. In many monastic traditions, there were strict rules about the use of voice. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the go-to manual for proper monk behavior, devotes entire chapters to when and how speech, and by extension, song, should occur. Sound, in these walls, is a tool. A sacrament. Not to be wielded carelessly. And this belief bled outward into the towns themselves. If monks, the most devout among them, were careful about when they spoke or sang, shouldn't common folk show similar restraint? Historians still argue whether laypeople truly absorbed monastic silence as a guiding value, or whether it was more of a top-down pressure applied by church authorities. Either way, the cultural effect was real. People began to associate silence with sanctity. And early singing with, well, not sanctity. In fact, some medieval thinkers believed sound could distract the soul. That an untimely melody might draw attention away from the sacred rhythm of the day. Remember, morning wasn't just about chores or trade, it was a liminal hour, a sacred transition. You didn't want to greet the dawn with nonsense. There's a deliciously obscure anecdote from 14th century Spain about a cobbler's apprentice who sang bawdy love songs while unlocking the workshop at dawn. A local friar overheard and chastised him publicly, declaring, "Let not lust precede the liturgy." The poor boy was flogged, not for the lyrics, but for the timing. Singing that kind of song before matins? That was a cosmic faux pas. The fringe crowd took it even further. In certain esoteric Christian traditions, sound itself was believed to hold spiritual power. Chants, tones, harmonics, they were tools for aligning with the divine. So, imagine their horror at some hungover shepherd belting out love songs to his goats before the sun even cracked the sky. Blasphemous and off-key. You step into the monastery chapel, just as a group of monks begin to chant. Gregorian, probably. Low, slow, haunting. Perfectly timed. This is the sanctioned sound. And it's no coincidence that this is happening after sunrise. Everything is in its place. But outside these walls, sound gets complicated. You recall a tale from Flanders where early morning singing was likened to witchcraft. Not because of any spell, but because it was untethered, unscheduled, emotionally driven. And emotion, particularly joy or longing, could be suspicious if expressed too freely. Still, not all was doom and gloom. There were allowances, even in the strictest towns. Traveling minstrels, for example, were often excused from early singing laws as long as they had guild permissions and didn't sing of lust or death, which, frankly, is like telling modern musicians to avoid breakup songs and murder ballads, good luck. You leave the chapel and blink into the morning sun, now fully risen and casting dramatic beams across rooftops and pigeons. The market buzzes now. A child sings, poorly but enthusiastically, while juggling apples. No one scolds her, because now it's allowed. But rewind just an hour, and that same melody could have earned a sharp word, a cuff, or worse. There's a reason the church referred to certain hours of the day as canonical. They didn't just mark time, they marked meaning. The early morning hours, especially before matins or lauds, were liminal, sacred, reflective. Not for self-expression. Not for casual song. There's a fringe tale from Hungary about a woman who sang lullabies to her baby before the bell and was accused, not of witchcraft, but of arrogance. As if she were placing her personal needs above the sacred rhythm. The accusation didn't stick, thankfully, but it tells you a lot about the mindset. Morning was not yours. It belonged to something bigger. You start to notice other rules. A merchant carefully arranging his wares with rhythmic motions, but not speaking. A boy tugging at his mother's cloak, but she hushes him with a finger and a glance at the church. Even now, centuries later, these rhythms echo. Residual habits, inherited reverence. It's not that singing itself was bad. It's that improperly timed singing was disorderly. And disorder was a threat to both the spiritual and social architecture of medieval life. You sit near a low wall, listening again to the market noise. It's music in its own right now, boots scuffing, donkeys snorting, blades sharpening, bartering calls rising and falling like notes. This is the soundscape that was so carefully guarded. That early singing, loud and raw, might have ruined. Because here's the real secret. Silence wasn't just about peace. It was about control. And what better way to control a population than by telling them not just what to say, but when they're allowed to say or sing it. You leave the monastery behind, the scent of incense still clinging faintly to your cloak. The square ahead is alive now, dogs bark, someone's dropped a basket of onions, and an old man is playing something vaguely flute-shaped that sounds like it's been through a few too many rainstorms. And then you hear it, a voice, strong and sure, echoing from the steps of a chapel. But it's not just someone singing a morning ditty. It's a chant. Measured. Purposeful. Scripted. The moment you step closer, you realize this isn't spontaneous joy, it's ritual. A priest leads a group of acolytes in song, their voices rising together like a slow tide. Everything is deliberate. Everything is allowed. You might be wondering, if song was so sacred, why was there so much fuss about it being early? Well, here's the twist. It wasn't all singing that was frowned upon. It was the wrong kind, at the wrong time, in the wrong place. Especially when that place happened to be somewhere the divine was meant to be heard first. Because in medieval society, early morning belonged to God. And humans. They were supposed to be quiet guests in his time slot. It wasn't just that early singing was annoying, it was presumptuous. Imagine walking into a cathedral before the priest, climbing the pulpit, and shouting, "I've got the sermon today." That's what early morning singers were doing, symbolically at least. Trying to speak before the sacred voice had spoken. So when someone started whistling on their way to the bakery, they weren't just risking the ire of sleep-deprived townsfolk, they were, in a sense, cutting in line in front of the divine. Historians still argue whether this idea of spiritual hierarchy of sound was genuinely internalized by common folk or if it was mostly enforced by the clergy and local authorities. But it's clear that there was a cultural sense of reverence surrounding morning quiet. Breaking it wasn't just noise, it was an affront. That brings us to another layer, sound and social rank. The priest, of course, could sing before you. So could the monks. And sometimes the wealthy merchant who sponsored the church's new roof. But you, humble fishmonger with a decent falsetto? You'd better keep it zipped until the third bell. Control over sound, when it was made, and who was allowed to make it, was tied to power. People in charge didn't just own land or coin, they managed ambience. Which, yes, means there were literal class-based sound permissions. The town crier could yell before sunrise, but the apprentice who tried to sing to himself while sweeping the stables? Fined. In some cities, even musicians hired for festivals had to wait until the designated hour before playing a single note. But what about joy? You ask yourself. What if someone was simply happy? What if their voice bubbled up unbidden at the break of day? Well, therein lies the problem. Joy, especially unregulated joy, was unpredictable. And unpredictability made medieval town officials itchy. You turn a corner and find a small shrine tucked into a wall. The candle has long since gone out, but someone's drawn a little symbol in the dust, a circle with radiating lines, probably meant to represent the sun. And beside it, a child's crude drawing of a singer. Stick figure. Open mouth. 3 musical notes hovering above like little ghosts. It's innocent. And poignant. Because despite the rules, people still sang. Quietly. Carefully. Sometimes rebelliously. They hummed lullabies before the bells, whispered rhymes while feeding goats, or softly echoed ballads they'd learned from traveling minstrels. Not all voices could be silenced. And here's your quirky tidbit for this section. In parts of Bohemia, it was believed that if a maiden sang before dawn on Midsummer Day, she could summon her future husband's spirit, who would either kiss her or, less romantically, just point and vanish. Practical and slightly terrifying. Superstitions like this made early song both tempting and taboo. People flirted with it. Danced near the edge. Sometimes, they got away with it. Sometimes, they didn't. There's even a record from a Yorkshire village in the 1370s of a young shepherdess fined a day's wages for singing before sunrise. The record notes that her voice was pleasing but ill-timed, which feels like a backhanded compliment and a historical footnote no one wants on their resume. But not all singing was punished equally. Sacred chant was elevated. Secular song? Suspect. And then there's the matter of content. Religious songs, especially those following the structure of liturgical chant, were often more accepted, even if performed a tad early. But bawdy tavern songs? Love ballads? Drinking rhymes? Those were rarely forgiven for bad timing. You see, it wasn't just about what hour it was about what message you were projecting into the still dark air. And in that medieval worldview, sound carried power. Words spoken or sung had weight. The wrong phrase at the wrong time could be a curse, a jinx, a spell, a summons. People feared what could be stirred from sleep by a mistimed tune. You pass another sign, this one carved in Latin into the arch of an old town gate, Vox ante lumen est superba. A rough translation: a voice before the light is prideful. That's what it really came down to, pride. The belief that you were important enough to break the silence. That your thoughts, your emotions, your melody deserved to be heard before even the sun had clocked in. Pride, as you might recall, was one of the big seven. And in a world where spiritual discipline was paramount, stepping out of line even with a song was a dangerous game. Still, the rules weren't everywhere the same. Some towns were stricter than others. Some just frowned at early singers. Others punished them. And a few, tiny rebellious pockets actually celebrated them. There's a report from a village in Brittany where people would rise early on solstice mornings specifically to sing before dawn as a kind of protest against rigidity. It was unofficial, of course, and risky. But it proves something important. Not everyone agreed that silence was sacred. And as you walk through this awakening town, song now threading itself between rooftops and alleyways, you start to feel the balance. Noise has returned. But it's no longer forbidden. It's chosen. Controlled. In harmony with the bells. For now. You wander deeper into the back streets of the town now, your boots pressing softly into dirt paths littered with stray feathers and bits of hay. The noise from the market fades behind you, replaced by something entirely different. A whistle. Then another. 2 short bursts, answered by a low, drawn-out trill. You freeze. That didn't sound like morning joy or a shepherd calling his sheep. It sounded intentional. Almost coded. And as you duck behind a barrel, pretending to examine a particularly suspicious-looking turnip, you realize you've stumbled into one of the lesser-known reasons some towns banned early singing, because not all songs were innocent. Not even close. A figure in a brown cloak passes by. He whistles again, 3 quick notes, the last one sharply cut off, and a second figure nods and disappears down a side alley. No bread baskets. No morning errands. Just quiet footsteps and coordinated sound. This wasn't just a melody. It was a message. Turns out, early singing wasn't always a sign of joyful peasantry or spiritual rebellion. Sometimes, it meant crime. Or something dangerously close to it. In many towns, certain melodies were used as signals. 2 short notes might mean the guard's asleep. A trill might say the merchant's wagon is leaving early. Whole tunes could indicate which gate was unlatched, which alley was clear, or whether the tavern owner was in on the plan. You wouldn't expect medieval folk songs to double as tactical communication, but they did. In some ways, the restriction on early singing was a medieval version of noise regulation crossed with public security. Historians still argue whether these songs were part of organized criminal codes or just spontaneous bits of local law passed among bored apprentices and rebellious teens. But there are real town records noting that certain singing was forbidden before the sun on account of thievery and subterfuge. That's academic speak, for we know you're planning something. There's a record from 15th century Bruges where a group of thieves used a common drinking song, sung softly before curfew, to indicate when they'd pulled off a successful burglary. Imagine that, using a catchy chorus as a victory jingle before skipping town. And get this, in some towns, authorities actually banned specific melodies because they were associated with rebellion. Not just general early singing, specific tunes. One popular English ballad called Maiden's Rise was outlawed before the 3rd bell because it had been used to gather people secretly in the early hours. Think of it like banning someone from playing the Game of Thrones theme because it kept making people storm the gates. Even more curious, singing wasn't just about thieves. Sometimes, it meant politics. You pass a small wooden tavern now, shuttered still, but just beyond it, scratched into a support beam, you notice what looks like musical notation. Primitive, sure, but distinct. Likely carved by someone who couldn't write much but knew their way around a tune. You can imagine them there, sneaking out before dawn, humming that same line under their breath as a warning or a rallying cry. In some towns, early songs served as protest. Discontent with taxes, the corrupt mayor, the grain shortage. Sing about it at the wrong hour, and you could get more than a slap on the wrist. Because a song, especially one before the bells, wasn't just a nuisance. It was defiance. You might not think of medieval Europe as filled with secret musical resistance, but it absolutely was. People who didn't have the means to write manifestos or publish pamphlets found other ways. A satirical rhyme. A dark lullaby. A melody everyone knew but no one dared to claim. It's no surprise that some towns created singing curfews to curb the potential for unrest. Control the sounds, and you control the mood. Control the mood, and you avoid riots. Simple, really. And let's not forget taverns. The most dangerous place for an early morning melody. A tavern courtyard. In cities like Lübeck and Milan, officials patrolled drinking establishments just before sunrise. Why? Because that's when the worst kind of singing happened, drunken singing. Loud, chaotic, irreverent. Often mocking the church or the city council. Sometimes just incoherent warbling about goats and ex-lovers. It wasn't just that this woke people up. It emboldened others. One song led to another. One singer became a group. Before long, you had a crowd. And in the Middle Ages, an unsupervised crowd was one bad joke away from becoming a mob. The connection between sound and rebellion was so strong that some cities actually tried to weaponize silence. Authorities would impose what they called hours of divine stillness, usually just before dawn, during which no sound was permitted except church bells. Anyone else making noise was seen as disrupting not just the peace, but divine order. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 1473, a rogue blacksmith in Prague invented a kind of one-man drum and horn contraption he wore on his back, specifically to protest noise laws. He'd rise before dawn, walk through the market square, and blast a full brass version of a drinking song at the break of day. He did this 3 times before mysteriously falling into a well. Authorities claimed it was an accident. People still debate that. Speaking of which, yes, historians still argue whether such enforcement was practical, or mostly symbolic. After all, it's hard to imagine every early hum being tracked. But when authorities did make examples of someone, it left a chilling effect. You pass 2 elderly women now, both seated on a bench under a slanted roof. One of them whispers to the other in the local dialect, and you catch only part of it, like old Honus, fined for that song about the mayor's daughter. They laugh, but glance around. Some echoes don't fade easily, because even now, generations later, the memory of what happens when you sing too early still lingers. There's a quiet wisdom in this, strange as it seems. That words, and the melodies we wrap them in, matter. Especially when spoken into the delicate, expectant quiet before the world fully wakes. A time when the air still holds dreams and intentions haven't yet hardened into actions. You walk on, the streets busier now. But even with the growing clatter of day, you can feel the tension that used to exist here. Every cobblestone seems to remember a time when a song was a secret. When a verse was a threat. When a tune in the dark could start something no one saw coming. And the guard who stopped you this morning? Maybe he wasn't just annoyed. Maybe he was trained to listen for the wrong kind of music. The marketplace hums. A butcher sharpens his cleaver to a rhythm that could pass for percussion. A fishmonger bellows a price that may or may not be exaggerated. Children race between stalls, and every so often, you catch someone whistling, humming, or even, gasp, singing out loud. And no one stops them. The transition is complete now. The town has shrugged off the hush of morning and donned its noisy, chaotic daily robe. Song, once forbidden, is now free. But as you stroll through the thickening crowd, it hits you. This music, though allowed, isn't random. There's a rhythm to it, a pattern. You're not imagining it. It's orchestrated. You step closer to the center of the square, and there it is, a guild-sponsored troupe, tuning their instruments beside a decorative well. One of them is plucking a rebec, another is setting up a drum that smells suspiciously like goat. A lute player sits cross-legged on the stone rim, lazily running scales that sound like the medieval equivalent of stretching before a sprint. This is no coincidence. This is sanctioned sound. And this brings us to yet another reason singing laws existed at all: to protect the official musicians. See, back in the day, not everyone was allowed to just pick up a lute and play wherever, whenever they pleased. In many medieval towns, music wasn't just art, it was trade. And like all trades in the Middle Ages, it was ruled by guilds. Enter the musicians' guilds, real, structured organizations of trained performers who paid dues, followed rules, and, often, had exclusive rights to perform in public spaces during designated hours. And guess what? Morning hours, especially just after sunrise, were prime time. So if some random farmhand started belting ballads before dawn, not only was he breaking curfew, he was stealing work. Historians still argue whether guilds pressured towns to enforce anti-singing laws or if they simply benefited from existing ordinances. But we do know that many guild charters explicitly stated that members had to follow performance schedules. Some even fined their own musicians for playing outside of assigned hours. Discipline wasn't just for monks, it was for minstrels too. In towns like Cologne and Avignon, guild musicians would be hired by the city to provide daily performances, usually timed carefully with the ringing of bells or market hours. These performances weren't just entertainment, they were community rituals, part of the town's identity. Singing early could confuse the public, blur the line between performance and play, and most importantly undermine the authority of the guild. And remember, guilds weren't exactly chill collectives. They had hierarchy, power, influence. In some places, they could appeal directly to town councils or even royalty. If a butcher cut meat illegally, his guild could punish him. If a shoemaker used the wrong dye, same thing. And if a rogue bard sang too soon and drew a crowd that should have belonged to them, the musicians' guild could make life very unpleasant. You stroll past the group now warming up, and the leader gives you a quick nod. He knows you're not competition, you've got that just visiting the 1300s look about you, but he's watching all the same. He has to. His reputation, and that of his guild, depends on guarding the soundscape. And here's your quirky tidbit for the day. In one particularly dramatic episode from 1446 in Prague, a lone street performer dared to sing outside the guild's permitted hours. His crime? Performing a comedic version of the town's founding myth at sunrise, no less. The guild responded by literally drowning out his act with a trio of hurdy-gurdy players stationed at all four corners of the square. Petty? Absolutely. Effective? Sadly, yes. Control of music was control of mood. Control of narrative. The guilds didn't just want to protect their coin, they wanted to protect their storytelling rights. Which is wild, considering how we now think of street performers as free spirits. In the Middle Ages, they were more like freelancers encroaching on union turf. And the general public? They usually respected the rules. Not because they loved guilds, but because performance meant routine. Routine meant stability. And stability, especially after surviving plagues, famines, or the occasional Viking raid, was priceless. Still, there was always tension. Some towns had free singers, unaffiliated musicians who performed outside the guilds, often traveling from village to village. These rogue artists were often admired by the people and despised by the guilds. They'd play at weddings, funerals, even early morning harvest rituals. But if they stepped into a town with strict musical laws and started performing before the sanctioned hour, let's just say they didn't get a standing ovation. You wander over to a stall selling meat pies that smell like everything good and everything slightly questionable all at once. The baker's humming a tune as he works, but you recognize it. It's a guild-approved melody. A market song, light and rhythmic. Easy to remember, easy to match pace with. That's another layer to this story. Musical branding. Towns used official songs to reinforce schedules. Morning song A meant the market was open. Song B meant taxes were being collected. Song C. Time to stop loitering and sweep your storefront. When unofficial songs disrupted these patterns, people got confused. If someone started humming the tax collection song at dawn, people might panic. Or hide. Or riot. Or all three. It sounds silly now, but sound was one of the only reliable public signals in the absence of mass literacy. You might not read Latin, but you knew what it meant when the musicians started playing the time to get out of bed jig. So, controlling who sang what and when wasn't just snobbery. It was logistics. And then, of course, came the music police. Not an official title, sadly, but in many towns, certain officials were tasked with monitoring sound, especially around religious centers and public spaces. If someone played too early, or in the wrong key, or too spiritually sassy, they were reported. One record from a Bavarian town describes a city official noting down suspicious strumming outside the Baker's Guild before first bell. Imagine keeping a notebook dedicated to unauthorized lute solos. Some people really lived for drama. But that's the world you're in now, a place where music is sacred, regulated, and surprisingly bureaucratic. You move on, the smell of pies clinging to you, the guild musicians launching into their first tune. It's cheerful, grand, practiced, and perfectly timed. For a moment, you pause to listen, really listen, and it's clear, this town doesn't just wake up. It orchestrates itself. A high clear note from a nearby soprano floats above the bustle like steam rising from a kettle. You follow the sound through the side streets until you reach a modest wooden structure with stained glass windows and a weathered sign that reads House of St. Cecilia, School of Song. And just like that, the story gets even deeper. Because guess what? Singing in medieval towns wasn't just something people did. It was something they learned. And, often, something they were licensed to do. Welcome to the musical middle class of the Middle Ages, the students, apprentices, and rising talents who trained in institutions like this to ensure their singing was not only beautiful but legal. Inside, the air is thick with chalk dust and candle wax. A wiry old man in robes gestures wildly at a group of children attempting to harmonize while standing on one leg, a traditional breathing exercise, not a punishment, probably. Sheet music, or at least its medieval equivalent, lies sprawled across every bench. Someone in the back is clearly faking it. And what you realize here is that sound, specifically, early morning singing, wasn't just a matter of law or spirituality or guild monopoly. It was about training. Untrained voices were a threat. Not just to aesthetic standards, but to social structure. See, if anyone could just belt out a tune whenever they felt like it, you'd have sonic chaos. And in a time where sound carried meaning, religious, economic, symbolic, you needed regulation. The schools were one solution. Historians still argue whether these singing schools were more about civic pride or practical control. But records show that many towns invested in musical education specifically to prevent unlicensed or ill-timed singing. Teach the people how and when to sing, and you won't need to chase them through alleys with a citation scroll. In fact, in some towns, graduating from a song school earned you a certificate that allowed you to sing in designated public hours. That's right. A singing license. You couldn't legally sell mead or open a market stall without one either, but singing? Also regulated. It sounds absurd now, but in a way, it makes sense. Singing was a form of public expression. And public expression was a form of power. The town council wasn't about to let that go unmonitored. In certain towns like Antwerp and Ghent, these singing schools were attached to churches. Religious officials oversaw the curriculum. Students learned not only scales and harmonics but also when it was appropriate to perform sacred versus secular songs. Early morning. That was for chants and prayer songs only. Sing a love ballad before the sun and you could find yourself back in remedial mode, or worse, banned from performing altogether. You take a seat in the back row and watch as the lesson continues. The teacher now explains the different modes of chant, their moods, their uses, and yes, their assigned hours. Apparently, even melodic scale had a time slot. Imagine a world where Dorian mode is outlawed before breakfast. Welcome to that world. And here's your fringe tidbit. In parts of southern Germany, there were dawn choirs composed solely of those who passed a purity and pitch test. They were allowed, by council decree, to sing just before the official bells, as long as their songs were pre-approved. No improved. No joyriding into minor keys. This created something fascinating, a sonic elite. A chosen few who could pierce the sacred morning silence with divine harmony, like musical surgeons operating before the town woke. Of course, this created resentment. After all, what gave little Johann with the perfect tenor the right to sing at 5:45 a.m. while Marta the goatherd had to wait till 7? And you can bet that some people pushed back. There are reports of rival choirs, unofficial ones, forming just outside city walls. Groups of farmers, shepherds, and retired mercenaries who'd gather before dawn and sing whatever they wanted, however they wanted, just out of earshot of the local magistrate. Their motto? If it rhymes, it's fine. You make your way out of the song school and back into the day, past a pair of students arguing over whether humming counted as singing under town law. One insists that melodic breathing should be exempt. The other claims even birds were once fined for being too enthusiastic. They're probably both wrong. But their debate highlights something key. Everyone had an opinion about when singing was acceptable. And it wasn't just about noise. It was about access. Who could perform? Where? And at what time? Even traveling performers, those wandering bards who roamed from court to village, were expected to obey local sound laws. Many had to check in with the town authorities before they could sing a note. Some were required to perform a brief test song in the presence of a clerk. If the clerk deemed it unfit for public consumption, or not in harmony with the town's spiritual mood, that was that. You were done before you began. In one famous case in 1421, a French jongleur named Tibelet was denied permission to perform in Reims because his songs were considered too saucy for a week that coincided with Saint Berthavin's feast. Tibelet retaliated by performing just outside town limits and was rewarded with a record crowd and 3 arrests. Art finds a way. You pass a small square now, where a group of young apprentices is rehearsing a song quietly among themselves. They pause as a magistrate strolls past, suddenly switching to a Gregorian tone. The moment he's gone, they giggle and revert to a tune about a love-struck blacksmith. The timing is precise, almost choreographed. And there it is again, that sense that even rebellion had a rhythm. That even joy had to obey tempo. Because while some medieval towns may have banned early singing to preserve sanctity or sleep, many did it to preserve order. And when song becomes law, timing becomes everything. You keep walking, the day bright now. Bells toll again, marking the hour. Somewhere, a trained choir launches into a town anthem. And for a moment, the air is thick with harmony. Not freedom, maybe, but harmony. The bells finish their chorus, echoing through the crooked alleys like a polite reminder. You're still in their world, not yours. The town feels settled now, like it's wearing its midday face. No more tiptoeing around sound. No more whispered melodies. The noises of trade and toil crescendo and clash with reckless enthusiasm. Horses clop, blacksmith's hammer, someone in a window sings an off-key lullaby to a crying child, and no one scolds her. Because by this point in the day, singing is fair game. But you begin to wonder what happens when no one listens to the rules. Let's talk enforcement. You pass a town square notice board, layers of parchment stapled and nailed haphazardly, like medieval spam. Most of it is boring stuff, missing goats, tax deadlines, and something about a mummer's play being postponed due to spontaneous combustion. But tucked in the corner is a brittle old proclamation. Let it be known, no man or woman shall lift their voice in song before first bell under penalty of fine or public rebuke, unless in service of divine right or sanctioned event. That's one way to keep folks quiet. You sit by a fountain as a rooster struts past like he owns the place. Probably does. And you start asking questions. Who made these laws? Who enforced them? And what exactly did public rebuke mean? Let's dive in. The rules about singing too early weren't just vague customs. In many places, they were etched into city ordinances. Local councils, often in coordination with the church, drafted them, posted them, and updated them like early versions of noise bylaws. And these weren't idle threats, town watchmen or wardens were tasked with enforcing them. Picture this. A teenager sneaks out before sunrise and starts crooning a love song beneath someone's window. A neighbor complains. A warden, probably half asleep and very grumpy, lumbers over and issues a warning or, if it's not the first offense, a fine. Sometimes, that wasn't the end of it. If the singer was particularly persistent, the punishment escalated. Historians still argue whether public rebuke was mostly symbolic, like a formal scolding, or whether it involved more theatrical shaming. But records suggest a mix. In England, you might be summoned to the town square and forced to recite a penitential psalm in front of an audience. In parts of Italy, early singers could be made to wear a tunic painted with musical notes and walk silently through the marketplace. Irony as punishment. Then there were the singing stocks. Yes, that's a thing. In several Germanic towns, special stocks were designated for disturbers of sacred mourning. The miscreant would be locked in with a sign overhead, too loud, too early. In some cases, they were required to hum quietly during their sentence, a subtle but hilarious form of mockery. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit. In a town near Lake Geneva, authorities once ordered a repeat offender to carry a caged nightingale around his neck for a full day. The symbolism? Let the bird sing for you. Surprisingly poetic. Probably itchy. Of course, enforcement wasn't always so performative. Sometimes, it was simply financial. A halfpenny fine here, a full penny for repeat offences. For context, that might be a full day's earnings for a laborer. So no, this wasn't a slap on the wrist, it was a decent slap to the coin pouch. And the church? It had its own punishments. In religious towns, especially those governed by ecclesiastical law, singing before sanctioned hours could result in penance. You might be denied communion for a week. You might be assigned extra fast days. In one particularly strict Benedictine town, a butcher who sang a secular tune before matins was forced to donate his week's profits to the poor and sit in silence for a full Sunday service with a candle in his mouth. And yes, it went out halfway through. He sneezed. Everyone applauded. You're probably wondering how this didn't turn into outright rebellion. Surely people wanted to sing. Surely they were annoyed. And they were. Which is why towns eventually had to get creative. Some cities introduced grace hours, designated windows just before official bell times where people could softly sing approved songs. Think of it like musical probation. Others issued permits for early morning music tied to festivals or harvests. Some even created community choirs with pre-dawn privileges, as long as they didn't get cheeky with the lyrics. But for the everyday villager, the rules still loomed. So, people got clever. One popular workaround was what you might call coded humming. Instead of singing lyrics, villagers would hum rhythms or nonsensical syllables, technically not breaking the song rule. It became a game, a form of resistance wrapped in sound. In one town, there was a whole underground trend of pre-bell ditties, short, muttered tunes only locals knew. One went something like, dee-dum-dee, oats for thee, don't get caught or pay the fee. Catchy and practical. You smile at the thought, watching a pair of teenagers quietly beatbox with their hands behind their backs, barely audible. Centuries may have passed, but the spirit of passive defiance is eternal. And yet, the enforcement, strange, theatrical, occasionally bird-related, worked. At least in part. Because rules that are visible, that get acted out in the street, paraded through town, or recited by sheepish offenders, tend to stick in people's minds. The law against early singing wasn't just about order. It was about reminding people where they stood, when they were allowed to speak, and when, no matter how beautiful their voice, they were expected to wait. Because in a town where bells speak first, your voice comes second. By now, you've passed from the heart of town into the sprawl of its outer edges. The air smells greener here, less bread, more mud. Chickens cluck indignantly near a half-mended fence, and someone nearby is chopping wood with an alarming sense of rhythm. You pass by a narrow footbridge, worn thin in the middle by centuries of hurried feet. It leads toward a small hamlet just beyond the city walls, still part of the town's rhythm, but not quite under its direct thumb. And here's where things get especially interesting. Because the story of early singing isn't just about cathedrals and councils and townspeople dodging fines. It's also about the borderlands, the spaces just outside town control, where the laws got fuzzy. Out here, beyond the bell's immediate reach, people sang differently, freely, and often illegally early. These were the gray zones of medieval soundscape control. You pause by a field where a farmer is guiding oxen across rows of tilled soil. He's humming something, a steady, rising and falling tune that matches the pace of the plow. It's not sacred. It's not sanctioned. But it's beautiful in its own lopsided way. He sees you, nods, and keeps humming. And that's your first hint. Out here, nobody's watching. Which is exactly why singing laws had trouble holding their ground. See, town authorities had limited jurisdiction. Their power stopped at the edge of the walls or wherever the charter said it did. Beyond that, well, technically, they could try to enforce sound ordinances. But good luck marching a warden 2 miles into barley fields to stop a shepherd from belting a lullaby to his sheep. Historians still argue whether the countryside actively resisted sound laws or simply ignored them due to distance. Either way, this created a kind of unofficial acoustic wilderness. Townsfolk might follow the rules, or pretend to, but villagers, they'd sing when they woke up, regardless of whether the bell had rung. And that caused problems. Because as towns grew, their sound laws spread. What began as a city ordinance slowly crept outward, especially along trade routes and farming villages that supported the urban economy. Suddenly, what used to be private space, your barn, your lane, your clearing near the river, was being policed, at least on paper. The church, of course, was all for it. Morning was for prayer, no matter where you lived. Singing early, even far from town, was considered spiritually presumptuous. A layman's voice should not rise before a priest's, whether inside a cathedral or outside a chicken coop. And so began the great rural resistance, not with pitchforks and torches, but with softly sung folk tunes before dawn. You find a log to sit on as the sounds of the field drift in and out. There's a strange defiance in it, isn't there? A melody sung not in protest, but in indifference. These weren't villagers fighting laws, they just didn't see why the laws mattered out here. It wasn't rebellion. It was rhythm. And here's your fringe tidbit. In 13th century Wales, a traveling monk recorded that some shepherds would deliberately sing at sunrise to cool down the jealousness of townfolk who sleep behind stone and think themselves rulers of time. That's not just early singing, that's medieval trolling. Eventually, some towns responded with buffer laws, essentially sound rules that applied to the areas just outside the walls. Anyone living within, say, 500 paces of the town gate might still be fined or censured if caught singing too early. But these were hard to enforce. A clever singer could claim they sang just beyond the zone. A tune drifting on the wind could come from anywhere. And besides, how do you measure paces on a foggy morning when no one's awake but the cows? So towns started leaning on the church network instead. Local priests, often stationed in small chapels or wayside shrines, were given the authority to report early singers. In theory, this was supposed to bring spiritual order to the outer regions. In practice, it turned churchmen into reluctant snitches. Many refused to enforce it. A few took it too far. And at least one, according to a letter found in a London abbey, started leading pre-dawn sing-alongs just to spite his bishop. You begin walking again, and as the hamlet fades behind you, you realize something. Outside the walls, song is alive. Not regulated. Not rehearsed. Not pinned to a schedule. It grows like weeds. Unruly, maybe, but undeniably human. Of course, this caused a kind of cultural split. Towns became the keepers of proper music, structured, polished, law-abiding. Countryside music became looser, more oral, passed down in melody, not manuscript. And crucially, sung whenever the mood struck. And sometimes, these two worlds clashed. A famous example? The festival of the Border Bells in a Flemish town circa 1384. Each year, town musicians would march to the edge of city limits to reclaim the morning sound. In response, villagers would gather just beyond, singing back slightly earlier, slightly louder. It wasn't war, but it was a musical standoff. Some years, it turned festive. Other years, not so much. One poor flautist reportedly lost 3 teeth to a hurled turnip. But this tension tells you something vital. That sound, even simple, early song, is never just about the note. It's about who owns the moment. About whose voice gets to fill the silence first. About which world wakes up singing, and which waits for permission. And here's the kicker, for all their rules and fines and morning patrols, the towns never really won. Out here, people still sing. Maybe not always loudly, maybe not with perfect pitch, but freely. You smile as a child's voice rings out from a nearby cottage, singing something indecipherable but joyful. The windows open. The light is gold. And not a bell in earshot. Out here, the only curfew is the sunrise itself. The sky above is starting to lean amber now, with clouds curling like old parchment around the sun. Afternoon has settled into that lazy, golden stretch where time feels thick and honeyed. The sounds of the town soften. Hammering slows. Chickens roost. Even the children start speaking in slightly lower decibels, as if sensing the day's quiet descent. But your journey's far from done. Because we've talked about singing laws inside the towns, the struggles outside the walls, and even the guilds and schools that tried to shape the soundtrack of medieval life. Now it's time for a twist in the tale you didn't see coming. Let's talk about how early singing intersected with fear. Not of crime, not of guild rivalries, but of something deeper, stranger, of the supernatural. You step into the shade of a half-crumbled chapel, the kind with ivy creeping up one side like gossip and stained glass windows too dusty to impress. An old stone bench beckons you to rest, and as you sit, you notice a weathered mural on the wall, figures with open mouths, reaching toward the sky in what could be prayer or panic. Because in many medieval towns, there was a long-standing belief that singing too early wasn't just annoying or unlawful, it was dangerous. Spiritually, cosmically, existentially. Why? Because the hours before dawn, those shadowy gaps between night and morning, were considered liminal. A time when the boundaries between worlds blurred. Between the living and the dead. Between the divine and the diabolical. To raise your voice before the bells rang, before the town had been spiritually claimed by prayer or ritual, was to invite something else to listen. Historians still argue whether these fears were rooted more in pre-Christian folklore or in early church superstition. But the belief was widespread: singing too early could summon things. You glance around, suddenly aware of how quiet the chapel is. Not creepy quiet, just thick with the feeling that someone, somewhere, might be listening. Back in the day, many people believed that specific hours of the night were claimed by various spirits. The hour before dawn was often thought to belong to wandering souls, those caught between death and salvation. Singing during that hour was seen as either calling to them or mocking them. That's not something you'd want to do accidentally over a breakfast jingle. In towns throughout France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, legends abounded of people who dared to sing before the bells and were found mute by sunrise. Cursed to silence for disrupting the sacred stillness meant for the unseen. One famous story involves a miller's daughter who sang a love ballad before sunrise and woke to find her song echoing back, sung perfectly, by no one she could see. Spoiler: she moved. Immediately. And here's your quirky tidbit: in parts of rural Poland, there was a belief that singing too early could trick the roosters into crowing prematurely, which in turn could disrupt the balance of time itself, leading to bad harvests, sick livestock, and, very specifically, over salty cheese. That's right. Medieval people feared ghosts, demons, and disappointing dairy in equal measure. So towns weren't just trying to preserve peace. In many cases, they were protecting people from what they feared would answer back. This fear wasn't always vague, either. Sometimes, it was very specific. In one illuminated manuscript from a monastery in northern England, a marginalia sketch shows a man covering his ears as a figure in monk's robes sings from behind a tree. Next to the scene, a line in Latin, roughly translated as "he sang too soon and the forest sang him back." What does that mean? No one really knows. But the record shows that some town curfews explicitly used language like no raising of voices before the third bell lest the veil be disturbed. That wasn't legalese. That was theological caution. Even bells themselves weren't just timekeepers. They were believed to ward off spirits. Their sound sanctified the town. To sing before them, that was like trying to bless the bread before the priest had arrived. And for those particularly sensitive to such things, hermits, mystics, local weirdos, morning song was a spiritual act. It had to be done in harmony with sacred time. Jumping the cue meant throwing everything off. The melody of creation, out of tune. You rise from the chapel bench and head toward a hill path now, where the town cemetery comes into view. Quiet. Clean. Surprisingly well tended. Just beyond the iron gate is a stone circle where, according to the plaque, locals used to gather at sunrise on feast days to sing psalms in harmony. But only after the first bell. There are reports from towns across Europe that graveyards were considered especially sensitive to premature sound. Not because of acoustics, but because it was believed that the dead rested lightly in the hour before dawn. A misplaced melody could stir them. Some priests even walked the edges of burial grounds at first light, ringing handbells and muttering blessings not for the living, but for those who might hear wrong. And so, rules against early singing weren't always about law and order. Sometimes, they were about fear. About keeping the fabric of reality from fraying at the seams. About making sure no one accidentally invited a midnight mass of the wrong kind. You pause at the cemetery gate and lean on it gently, watching the sun inch lower. It's peaceful. It really is. But if you listened hard enough, you might believe the silence hummed. Even now, there's something about those early hours that feels off-limits. Like the world is holding its breath. Like time hasn't quite decided whether it's night or day. It's the in-between. And in the Middle Ages, the in-between was never safe. That's why they made laws. Not just to keep drunks and bards in line, but to protect the timeline. To hold space for the sacred. To make sure no one got too eager with a song and ended up singing a duet with something from beyond. Silly. Maybe. But comforting, in a weird way. Because behind every strict-sounding law, every fine or penance or warning, was a very human truth. We're afraid of what we don't understand. And sometimes, silence is the bravest sound of all. The sun is sliding down now, brushing rooftops with orange gold like a painter who's been at it all day and finally wants to clean their brushes. The town has softened again, everything dimmer, slower, like the world is exhaling. Somewhere in the distance, a trio of flutes plays a sleepy tune. This time, no one finds them. The hour approves. You wander back toward the main square, and as torches begin to flicker alive, your thoughts shift toward something that's quietly threaded through this entire tale. Status. Because if you think early singing laws were applied equally across all people, well, you clearly haven't been paying attention to how human beings work. Tonight, you learn that who you were determined whether your song was a crime, a blessing, or a charming quirk. Let's start at the top. If you were nobility, you could basically sing whenever you liked. Not always without consequence, but with fewer consequences than, say, a fishmonger with bad breath and unpaid taxes. Noble households were often exempt from town curfews, including sound-related ones. If the lord's daughter wanted to warble her favorite hymn while brushing her hair before sunrise, no warden was going to barge in with a citation scroll. Not unless he wanted to find himself reassigned to sore maintenance. Historians still argue whether these exemptions were formalized by town charters or simply tolerated through fear and politics. But there's little doubt, social rank muffled a lot of off-schedule singing. In fact, early morning music was sometimes used as a power flex. A visiting dignitary might have their musicians perform a dawn serenade as a subtle "we run on our own time" declaration. It wasn't just music, it was audible dominance. You pass a finely dressed couple now, heading home with their servants trailing behind. One of the servants is humming a soft, careful tune. He stops the moment his master turns to speak. That, right there, is status in action. Then you have the clergy. They were the exception to nearly every singing ban. Their morning chants and rituals were not only allowed, they were expected. But even here, there was hierarchy. High-ranking priests or abbots could initiate early sacred music with impunity. But a novice monk caught vocalizing a hymn a few minutes too early, that could trigger discipline. There are letters from monastic records reprimanding young brothers for enthusiasm and sanctioned by hour. You gotta love a world where being too eager to sing about God got you side-eyed by your boss in a cassock. Now, slide a little further down the social scale into the merchant class. Tricky spot. Merchants had money, but not always power. And town councils were often composed of merchants, so the rules had to apply to them publicly, at least. There are surviving ordinances where merchants could apply for singing exceptions during specific times of year. Think harvest fairs, patron saint days, or spring markets. These permits often cost money. Surprise! Singing, like everything else, was monetized. Want your cloth stall to stand out at dawn? Pay the permit, hire a musician, and sing away. But woe betide the shopkeeper who sang early without that parchment. The fines were higher for them than for peasants, because they were expected to know better. Which brings us, of course, to the poor. For commoners, especially the laboring class, early singing laws hit hardest. Not just because they were enforced more strictly, but because poor folks often had to start their day before the bells. Bakers, milkmaids, gravediggers, brawls all were up before sunrise, working in the shadows. And sometimes, you sing to pass the time. You hum to stay awake. You chant to keep rhythm. But if a warden heard it, that could mean trouble. One baker in Bruges was fined 3 times in 1 month for unauthorized melodic output while kneading before dawn. He finally posted a sign that read, "I'm talking to the dough, not singing." It didn't help. So, of course, early song became a class-coded thing. If you sang before sunrise and wore velvet, charming. If you sang before sunrise and smelled like oxen, disorderly. You take a turn down a quieter street now, where smoke curls from chimneys and the world feels half asleep already. A woman hums as she lays out herbs to dry, and no one interrupts her. Because at this hour, singing doesn't challenge authority, it calms it. And here's your quirky fringe detail. In some towns, performers could rent a noble's name for a day. For a small fee, your traveling band could declare that they were under the patronage of Sir Reginald of Alderthorne, whether he'd ever heard of you or not. This loophole often allowed music to sneak past time restrictions, because the right name gave your voice a VIP pass. Until Sir Reginald found out. Then came the angry letters. The final layer of this hierarchy: children. Children could sometimes sing early, especially if they were part of choirs. Towns loved to parade young voices during special events. But even then, only the right children. Orphanage choirs? Good. Farm kids yelling songs at passing wagons? Bad. The most heartbreaking bit. Some towns employed child informants, yes, you heard that right, encouraging youngsters to report on neighbors who sang too early. One record in northern Italy even shows that a child who tattled on a morning fiddler was awarded a loaf of bread and the honorary title Defender of the Dawn. We do not recommend this as a parenting strategy. And so, as the sun slips below the edge of the fields and the first real chill of evening rides in on the breeze, you start to see the whole shape of this strange, musical law. It wasn't just about sound. It was about power. Who held it? Who didn't? Who could afford to break the silence, and who paid for it? Because in the medieval world, a song wasn't just a melody. It was a statement. And not everyone was allowed to make it. Evening has fully unfurled now. The sky is awash of navy and indigo, and the stars, those ancient, blinking pinpricks, are beginning to claim the heavens like shy dancers creeping onto a stage. Down below, the town settles into its final form: quiet hearths, flickering torchlight, creaky shutters closing like eyelids. The music of the day is almost done. Almost. Because this hour, this velvety in-between, is when another kind of voice often dared to emerge. Not the voices of guild singers or priestly choirs, but of travelers, outsiders, and those who lived on the edge of lore and legend. And now, we shift our focus to a group you might not expect in this story about singing laws: the outsiders, the wanderers, the nomads, the people who belonged everywhere and nowhere and sang anyway. You find yourself now near the town's outer gate, where a small fire flickers in a shallow pit. A figure warms her hands nearby, a woman dressed in layered shawls, a scarf wrapped tightly over her head, and a necklace of carved bone beads swaying slightly as she hums to herself. Not a local. Not from any place that shows up neatly on a map. And yet, here she is, part of the town's soundscape whether the law likes it or not. In medieval towns across Europe, outsiders were treated with suspicion. Sometimes fascination. But mostly suspicion. And few groups were treated with more wariness and heard more carefully than the Romani, Jewish minstrels, foreign pilgrims, and nomadic entertainers who moved between settlements. These people didn't just ignore early singing laws. They often redefined them. Historians still debate how much contact medieval European towns had with Romani groups during the early period, but by the 14th and 15th centuries, their presence was widely noted. And with them came instruments, styles, rhythms that didn't quite fit into the sanctioned musical molds towns were used to. And that unsettled people. See, towns liked predictability, bells, chants, guild-approved set lists. Outsiders didn't just sing unfamiliar melodies, they sang them at strange hours, in strange places, often with strange meanings. And worst of all, people liked it. Townsfolk would gather just beyond the gates at dusk to hear wandering singers from Spain or the East. They'd slip out early in the morning to catch a lullaby sung in Ladino, or a tale told in Romani rhythms, or a haunting melody from someone claiming to have once played in the court of a Persian sultan. And this caused no small amount of tension. Because the moment a townsperson, especially someone low on the social ladder, preferred that kind of music over the official soundscape, the authorities started sweating. So, laws weren't just made to ban early singing. They were used to exclude the singers themselves. You pause by the fire, and the woman notices you. She doesn't speak, but nods once. Her voice, when she resumes humming, is low and smoky. You don't know the song, but it feels like something you've always known. Many towns, especially in Central Europe, implemented curfews for travelers that forbade them from singing or playing instruments inside town limits, especially in the hours before or after bell times. Some of these laws were explicit. Others were coded. They didn't say no Romani music, for instance. They said no exotic tunes after the last bell. A legal fig leaf for discrimination. There are documented cases of wandering Jewish minstrels being allowed to perform, but only during very narrow windows. If their prayers or songs happened to fall early in the morning, as some did, they were threatened with punishment unless they did so in silence or far from the town's ear. And yet, these songs persisted. Because music is slippery. It leaks through cracks. It floats through shutters. It rises with the steam of morning soup and falls with the night wind. And even when it's banned, it spreads. Here's your fringe tidbit. In one Bohemian town, officials banned all non-local singing within 2 hours of dawn. But decades later, music historians traced the town's most popular lullaby back to an Armenian traveler who passed through once and sang it to a crying infant. The townspeople loved it so much, they just changed a few words, then called it their own. And here's the most quietly subversive truth: early singing by outsiders often outlived the laws made to suppress it. Because while written rules fade, melodies tend to linger. Outsiders brought songs that didn't care about curfew. They carried lullabies from long-dead grandmothers, invocations from mountain temples, chants meant to summon rain or banish wolves. Songs that were less about performance and more about survival. And when those songs were sung before the town bell, it wasn't always rebellion. Sometimes, it was mourning, or joy, or simply a way to remind yourself who you were, in a world always trying to tell you otherwise. You stand now at the gate, listening as another figure joins the fire circle. A young man with a dulcimer. He strums it tentatively. The tune is unfamiliar, soft, unhurried. It's not loud enough to break any law, but it's early enough to raise eyebrows. And still, no one stops him. Because that's the secret. Over time, towns softened. Not all of them. Not quickly. But the edges began to fray. The sharp lines between sanctioned sound and forbidden melody blurred. People started choosing beauty over regulation. Curiosity over control. Eventually, some towns even invited outsiders to teach their songs. A few bold councils issued dawn performance permits specifically to attract exotic entertainers. Not out of generosity, of course. Out of economic interest. A new song meant a new crowd. And a new crowd meant money. And so, a loop formed. Ban it, miss it, sneak it in profit. You smile as the dulcimer's rhythm picks up, joined now by a soft voice singing words you can't translate. But somehow, you still understand them. Because this song wasn't meant for laws or lists. It was meant for the in-between. And in that moment, you realize something. Some songs only make sense before the world wakes up. The stars are out in full now, bold and bright as if they've decided tonight deserves their A-game. Overhead, the constellations blink in their ancient choreography, oblivious to everything happening down here on the cobbled streets. You walk slowly through town, the torchlight now scarce but familiar. It flickers across stone walls and shuttered market stalls, casting long, warped shadows that dance when you move. The town is quiet, not silent, just holding its breath. And just when you think the story might be winding down, you arrive at something both ordinary and extraordinary. A small wooden door, half open, soft light spilling from within, and the low, unmistakable hum of a song circle. Yes, a singing circle. Late at night. Definitely not sanctioned. Almost certainly breaking a few local ordinances. And yet, no one's stopping it. Because this final chapter of your journey brings us to a secret held in plain sight. Towns may have written laws against early singing, but the people always found ways to sing anyway. You step inside, ducking beneath a crooked lintel, and the warmth hits you first: firelight, pressed bodies, the dense smell of stew and straw mats. Around the room sit men, women, even a few children, some with mugs, others holding instruments. One person sings a verse. Another picks it up. Then another. No sheet music. No plan. Just music as survival. This isn't a church. Or a school. Or a tavern with a sign. It's someone's home opened up tonight, like it was on dozens of other quiet evenings, to make space for the one thing every town law could never fully suppress. Communal song. Historians still argue whether gatherings like this were a form of resistance or just a way to pass the time. But records suggest that in nearly every town with strict sound laws, there were underground musical cultures, spaces where early or forbidden songs lived on. Some in basements. Some in barns. Some in half-collapsed watchtowers repurposed by the bold and bored. And not all of them were secret in the dramatic sense. Some were just quietly tolerated. Because even the people writing the laws knew, you can't silence everything. You sit down in a corner, and someone offers you a crust of bread and a nod that says, "You're welcome here." And for a moment, you don't feel like a listener. You feel like a voice. Many towns had house harmonies, informal gatherings hosted by families who loved music and knew how to bend the rules. These weren't public performances. No one charged admission. But everyone knew they happened. And crucially, they didn't start after the bells. They started before. Not recklessly early, just enough to feel thrilling. Just enough to brush against the law and come out singing. And it wasn't just the music. It was what people sang. Songs you weren't supposed to know. Verses that had been banned by guilds. Refrains that mocked town officials or rewrote sacred chants into lullabies about cabbage stew. Here's your fringe tidbit. In a port town in northern France, there was a whole genre of music called quiet tide songs, composed specifically to be sung under your breath during illegal hours, often using coded language so officials couldn't tell whether you were praising a saint or complaining about taxes. Same melody. Very different meaning. And here's the wild part. Some of the people in those circles were the same ones who enforced the rules by day. That's right. Town scribes. Junior priests. Even a few wardens, once their shifts ended. Everyone needs to sing sometimes. Even hypocrites. Because in the end, singing isn't just performance. It's memory. Emotion. A way of being in your body when the world around you tells you to disappear. It's no accident that many of the earliest lullabies were protests in disguise. Or that the first harmonies children learned were the ones their parents weren't supposed to sing. And it's no accident that these private gatherings, these just before the bell circles, often became more popular than the town's official choirs. Why? Because they were honest. No license required. No performance fee. Just a handful of weary souls, gathered around a hearth, humming old melodies and writing new ones out of breath and heartache and hope. And here's something historians love to point out, though it's hard to prove. Some of the songs that towns eventually adopted into official use, church hymns, public anthems, seasonal festival tunes, they started here. In these illegal hours. Whispered first by one tired voice, then picked up by others, refined in darkness, and eventually passed into daylight. You watch now as a girl, no older than 10, begins a tune in a voice so clear and high it sounds like the air is singing. No one scolds her. No one tells her to wait for the bell. In this room, her timing is perfect. And that, really, is what this entire journey's been about. Not just who could sing and when, but who chose to sing anyway. Because the laws about early singing were never just about sound. They were about control. And when people sing outside of sanctioned time, they're not just breaking a rule. They're reclaiming the hour. Reclaiming morning. Reclaiming voice. Reclaiming the right to fill the silence before the day decides who you're supposed to be. And sometimes, that reclaiming happens not with a shout, but with a song so soft, so early, so full of truth, it changes the law just by existing. And just like that, the song circle fades behind you. You step back out into the cool night, the door clicking softly shut, as if sealing the music safely inside. The cobbled street is near silent now, lit only by the faint glow of an oil lamp dangling above a stoop. A cat trots past like it owns the block. It probably does. You've walked through time tonight. Through laws and loopholes, bells and battles, whispers and wild harmonies. But as the final chapter unfolds, there's one last question hovering in the air like mist. Why did these laws ever fade away? Because they did. Slowly. Quietly. Like the way you stop hearing a noise when you're not sure if it's still there. You head toward the edge of town again, past the watchtower, now long retired, and the shadowy silhouette of the old bell mechanism, rusted into silence. If it still rings, it does so in memory alone. So what changed? Part of it was technology. The invention of mechanical clocks and personal timepieces meant fewer people had to rely on the church bell to tell them when the day began. You didn't need a public chime to know it was 6 a.m., your dusty little gear and wheel contraption said so just fine. As towns industrialized, time became more precise, but also more personal. People stopped listening up for bells and started looking down at watches. Then came urban expansion. As cities grew in the 17th and 18th centuries, sound became harder to police. You couldn't chase every voice through the winding alleys of a metropolis. Officials had bigger problems: plague, sewage, riots. A milkmaid singing too early just wasn't top priority anymore. You stroll past a bakery now, dark and closed, but you swear you can smell phantom bread. Maybe it's your imagination, or maybe some things are too stubborn to quit. Cultural attitudes shifted too. The Reformation and Enlightenment periods encouraged new relationships with sound. Music wasn't just for God or kings anymore. It became art, science, entertainment, and eventually business. And business loves music. By the 18th century, taverns began advertising early song performances. Opera houses scheduled rehearsals before dawn to squeeze in extra practice. Cities launched sunrise concerts on public squares. Imagine that, a crowd gathered on purpose before the sun, paying to hear someone break the very rule their grandparents were fined for. Irony? Absolutely. But that's how human culture works. It outgrows its boundaries. One generation's crime becomes the next generation's pastime. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Prague, a 17th century law still technically prohibited secular singing before morning prayers. But during a royal visit, townsfolk broke into a spontaneous pre-dawn chorus, and the visiting prince loved it so much, he ordered the law struck down and declared it a charming start to any day. Historians still argue whether the law was actually removed or just quietly ignored from that point forward. But the result was the same. the song won. And with time, so did the people. As the Industrial Revolution kicked into gear, soundscape laws evolved from religious mandates to noise ordinances, more about decibels than doctrine. By the 19th century, cities were far more concerned with steam engines, construction work, and rowdy pubs than whether someone was singing a ballad too early. Singing in the morning wasn't a threat anymore. It was an annoyance. At worst, a neighborly squabble. At best, a quirky habit. And then, somewhere between the invention of the telephone and the birth of pop radio, no one cared at all. Not because sound stopped mattering, but because control shifted. The town no longer owned the silence. You pause now at the top of a small rise overlooking the village. Everything glows faintly under the moon, rooftops, smoke stacks, winding streets like a dream drawn in graphite. A soft breeze carries the faintest sound of someone whistling. It's not early, not late, just in between. And that's where this story rests. Because in the end, all those medieval laws about early singing weren't really about time. They were about power. And power always needs permission. But music doesn't. It never has. Whether it was a baker humming over dough, a shepherd calling across the hills, or a little girl in a circle of firelight reclaiming a lullaby too old to trace, these were acts of defiance. Gentle, maybe, but defiance nonetheless. And as the bells fell silent, and the laws faded, the people kept singing. Not because they were allowed, but because they were alive. And now, finally, your feet rest. The town behind you is folded into sleep. The last echoes of song have drifted into nothing, and even the stars seem to hum a quieter tune. Breathe in. The night air is cool, still wrapped in the faint perfume of hearth smoke and lavender from some unseen window box. Somewhere nearby, an owl calls once, then, silence again. Not empty silence. Comforting. The kind of quiet that holds you, that cradles the weight of all you've seen tonight. You walked through gates and laws, listened at thresholds, wandered narrow lanes and wide fields. You heard the voices of bishops and bakers, of shepherds, strangers, and girls singing softly into firelight. And you learned what those old rules were really guarding. Not just time, but control. And yet, time moved on, as it always does. So let yourself settle now. Let the rhythm of the day fade from your bones. Let the music drift softly behind your eyes, like a lullaby that lingers even after the voice has stopped. There are no bells here. No fines. No watchers at the gate. Just breath. Yours. Steady. Easy. You don't need permission to rest. You don't need a curfew to fall asleep. The world has always tried to tell people when to speak, when to be quiet, when to rise, and when to wait. But tonight, you've remembered something older, deeper, softer than all of that. You are allowed to sing. Even when it's early. Especially when it's early. Now close your eyes. Let the hush hold you. And if a melody follows you into sleep, let it. It belongs to you.